Welcome back, and let's continue where we left off. So we're transforming objects into workplaces where entities can work for various effects, and in particularly as a sort of crafting station where you can take certain items and transform them into something else. And we use recipes to glue objects and incoming and outgoing items together. So just a quick reminder, our basic setup is that we have an object as a workplace, plus a set of input items that lead to some form of output item. And we do that by having the recipe generate craft jobs, and these craft jobs can be picked up by entities. In our last episode, we implemented the recipe data structure and made sure that it creates the correct type of jobs, both with the kind of properties of what it creates, but also the kind of requirements that it has. And in this episode, we're going to make sure that we can actually perform these craft jobs. So for now, so far we only have a definition. Today, we're going to look at implementing the functionality that is required for our entities to perform the actual craft jobs, and thus crafting new items. Now, so let's go into Xcode and let's start. So perhaps the best place to start is with writing a test. So we have our job tests list here, and let's create a new marker for craft jobs, and let's create our first test. So let's create a simple test that a craft job adds to inventory. So we're going to test the happy flow where we resolve a craft job and then the result is added to the inventory. So let's have an item to craft. This will be an item, then example item, and we'll have a craft job that is a job with the job call of craft, and this creates an item stack of item to craft, and we will get 2 out of these. It will have a target position of 0. It will have a build time of 1, and it won't have any requirements. So we're not using the recipe now to create a craft job. We're creating a job with a job call of craft directly. This way we can influence the requirements and we can really isolate the behavior of resolving the job instead of testing whether requirements are defined correctly and processed correctly. We already have tests for that, and we already validated that functionality. So we'll have a world for entity live in, and we have an entity, and this will be an example entity. This one can have any location, and we will push this new job on the job stack of the entity. Then we will assert that our entity's inventory for the item to craft will be default to 0 is indeed 0. So we don't have any item to craft with this yet. And then we will update the entity in the world. And then we'll assert that the entity's inventory for the item to craft, still a default value of 0, is now 2, because that's the amount we're going to craft. So let's see if this compiles, and the test should fail. And then Xcode completely failed. This happens sometimes as well, and particularly in the testing system. So that's pointedly we saved in time. So let's give it another go. So we'll test. And the test fails. Yeah, I agree. And this is because we haven't implemented any code for entity to actually resolve a craft job. So let's go to our entity and make sure that we implement this right now. So we have our complete job here, and we have an unimplemented job type. So we're ignoring this job. We will add a case for the for crafting, and let's create a job completion handler for crafting. So we will create a private function of craft, and this will take an item stack. This is what we're going to craft, and yeah, let's not do that just yet. So let's start simply by, we have an inventory, and we have an items for this item stack of item, and let's just set it to the item stack that's amount. This basically means we will override values, but we will add more later if we have to test to support it. So let's go to our complete job function, and let's take our case craft, and we'll get an item stack in, and let's see. We'll pop the job, but we will also craft the item stack. So this should now, if we go back to our test, it failed. Let's see, this is a failing test. Let's run it. And now it succeeds. Okay, let's go back to our job test. So, but what if we already have some in our inventory? So let's create a new test called craft a job, add to existing inventory. So we can copy paste a whole lot of stuff, almost this entire test, however, with a couple of changes. So we have our entity here. Let's say our entity already has an inventory for the item craft of 1. Then in our first assertion, we should have 1. And after the update, we should have 3. So because these two should be added. So let's run this test and see it fail. And it's failing because it's now 2, and it's because we are simply overwriting the amount. So it's not a very difficult fix. Let's first find our existing amount, and that's the inventory for item stack.item. And instead of directly setting this amount, we will take our existing amount and add the item stack amount. So this should now, this failing test should now pass. And let's make sure all the other tests should pass as well. Okay, so let's get back to our job test. So we're adding to the inventory. Let's also make sure that we have we implement now our requirement test for our object requirement. And the reason we're doing this right now is because the craft job is actually a very simple way of testing whether a job finished correctly or not. So let's test our job. Fails when object requirement does when required object does not exist. Let's create an item to craft. And let's create an object. This will be a workbench. And let's create a craft job. We've got craft as the job goal. This creates a new item stack of item to craft. And we will get 2. We do this at position 0. We'll have a build time of 1. And we'll have a requirement. We will have an object requirement, and the object name will be our required object of name. Then we will have world. Then we'll have an entity. This will be example entity at position 0. This entity will have this job pushed on the stack. Then we can assert that our entity's inventory for this item to craft is 0. We can update the entity, and then we can assert that, well, the test should fail, meaning that afterwards, again, we should still have 0 of this item in our inventory. And this is why the craft job is actually quite useful as a way of testing whether a job succeeded or not. You can simply look at some form of item and see whether it's being created afterwards or not. So this test will probably fail because we're never validating this requirement. So let's go to our entity. And let's look at where we are processing or checking all our requirements. We have a default here. Let's add one for the object. So we have an object name, and we should see if our world object, and it should be at the job position. So we're not looking for just any object and anywhere, but specifically whether the correct object is at the intended position for this job. If this the name, and if it doesn't exist, well, you can default it to an empty string. If this is not the same as the object name, which it will be either if it's nil or if it's something else, then we return false. And this should now make a requirement test pass. Okay, so we now also have tested that requirement jobs work. So let's go back to our job tests. I want to add a final test here that tests sort of the happy flow, but with all the requirements. So let's create an item to craft. Example item, and let's create a required object. And let's create a required item. Let's create an item requirement for an item stack with the amount the required item, and we need I don't know, 2. Let's create our craft job. And we should create an item stack of our items craft. And we will get 2 out at the position of right. There's a build time of 1. Then we have a set of requirements. So we have a position requirement. We have an object requirement. This is the required object name. And we have an item requirement. Then we have a world. In the world object. And this should be our required object. So we have a required object in the world. We have an entity. An example entity at the position right. That's the correct position because this is also the target position of the job. So we assume we're at the right position. And we take the job and we push it on the stack. And also our entity has in the inventory for the required item Ina, say 10. And then we assert that the entity's inventory for the item into the graph defaults to 0 is indeed 0 at first. Then we update the entity. And finally, we test whether we indeed got 2 back. So let's run this test. This test should pass because it's simply revalidating stuff we already validated. Note that I'm not going to check whether after this job the required item has been consumed, because we have a requirements test that already we should have a test already that shows that we consume items. And if we don't, yes, we have meeting the requirements, we consume items. So we already have a test. Perhaps the test is better suited as requirements test. But we're already at least validating that one. So we're not going to validate it again. Let's see, we have a job. So we created a couple of job tests for our craft jobs. I think there are some install object jobs on top of this one. I'll quickly create a mark here. So we know that these ones are there. And I think this meets our goal for today. So we are able to resolve craft jobs and we can test the object requirement as well. So in the third episode, next episode, the final one, we'll make sure that our world can spawn these jobs. So thanks for watching and have a good day.